I don't know if it's sweltering hot where you are at the minute, but
It's bloody hot. I'm in Essex. It's like northeast London. I've just come back from town. It's just insane. It's nice. I shouldn't complain,
I
but
know, but
yeah,
we're not used to it. I mean, I'm in this
nah.
sweaty little attic in my house, and I've got to shut all the windows to keep the sound out, and I can just feel myself getting redder
Oh,
and
really?
redder. If I pass out or take a funny turn, send help is what I'm trying to get across.
I will do. Don't worry. Don't worry. Same goes for me.
Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Harry Saul Markham. Harry, how are you doing?
Thank you, Stephen. I'm doing very well. Hot, but okay. How are
Yeah,
you?
we started. I'm great, thanks for asking. We did start this preamble in a very British way, didn't we? Talking about the weather. It's always a good go-to.
Well, there's
That
no other way to start a podcast, particularly when we're talking about the future of British identity. How else to start a podcast of this kind?
wonderful segue there. I mean, just to let people know, you've got a new book out. It's out now, isn't it? It's actually out. It's available to
Yes,
the
it's
world.
behind me.
It's behind you. There it is. The
Yeah.
title of which is "The Melted Pot: Diversity, Antisemitism, and the Limits of Tolerance." Now, there's some huge topics in there from, Islamism, immigration, liberalism, things like that. And I just thought, what made you want to delve into those really murky topics? Was there a single incident? Was it a collection of incidents? At what point did you think, I need to get something down about this?
Well, the book began, formally, the book began after a really terrifying incident on the streets of London, in Whitehall, in which a small group of Jews, and I was included in that small group, were attacked by a large mob. A large mob consisting probably mostly of men, many of whom were Muslim, and many of whom were accompanied by their children. And it really led me to think, well, how could this be in the streets of London, right? A city so widely celebrated for all these wonderful things, tolerance, openness, diversity, and so on. And so I began writing an article, and then I realized that this needs deeper reflection. This needs philosophical reflection, because it goes well beyond a kind of analysis of policy and policy shortcomings. It's really about cultural introspection. And so I then decided to write a book in order to offer a partial response to the question, how could one minority feel so threatened by another minority, and what does this mean for us all?
No, I mean, they're big questions, obviously. And you'd think, sort of in this age of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as it's termed, and people are crying out for kind of, to platform minority voices on various issues. But you had a great deal of trouble with your initial publisher on this book, to the point where they outright rejected it in the end. Is that correct?
Well, they cancelled it.
Right.
Because, of course, I wrote a book of a sensitive nature.
You was honest was the problem, I think.
Well, the last thing an author ought to do is write something that's of a sensitive nature, of course, particularly. That's the worst thing an author can do. But that the publisher themselves, and of course, really, I mean, I was looking at other case studies throughout the course of writing, and in fact, in a section in the book called The Politics of Fear, I look at how liberals retreat from their liberalism, and how, in this case, a perfectly reasonable liberal publisher was willing to walk away from a book because, frankly, they're scared. They're scared of the backlash, potential backlash. They're scared of all the kind of accusations, and they can't be bothered with it. And in a sense, I don't blame them, because really it's just not worth it now. But thankfully, my new publisher, a very young publisher, but an important player in the field now, who publishing books for people who have been cancelled and so on. Academica, they've been great, and they thankfully took this book on. But I have to say, throughout the course of trying to find a publisher in the UK, it was extremely difficult, because publishers in Britain were really quite reluctant to take a book of this kind on. And, from what I've heard in the industry, they're just not touching it now. So that's a real, and by the way, this isn't a kind of like, as you know, because I think you've read it. This isn't a sort of radical, hate-filled polemic or diatribe. It's anything but that. But even by its standards, even though it has these glowing endorsements from centrists and Muslim voices and so on, it's still too provocative or too perhaps unpalatable to the sensibilities of those who occupy these positions of liberal influence.
Yeah. I mean, I noticed as well, you got some amazing endorsements at the front of that book. Some of
Thank
some of
you.
my friends, Andrew Doyle's there. I mean, Stephen Fry as well is a big name to be, well known to people in the UK. How do you go about getting someone like Stephen Fry to endorse your book?
I just paid them loads of money.
That's the way to do it.
Well, yeah. Well, you see, Stephen Fry is a very interesting one. I feel that we're all a bit sort of disillusioned left-wingers, or disillusioned liberals, I'd say, in that we really are sort of, we believe in the virtue of rationality, we believe in secular states, we believe in the very principles upon which liberal democracies operate. And so we're fairly reasonable people, but we feel that liberalism itself has gone so wrong. And so, part of what I suppose drives the likes of Steven Pinker and Andrew Doyle and Stephen Fry and Pascal Bruckner, amongst others, is that we all are part of a team that wants to investigate where we have gone wrong, right? Where we as centrists, where we as liberals, where we as forward-thinking people have gone wrong. And by the way, I don't think we've gone wrong. I think we've laboured under some serious delusions. And I think that those delusions have paved the way for us to fall into this crisis of civilization. And we as liberals and forward thinkers and centrists want to understand how we got here and critically what we can do about it.
You'll find anti-Semitism with the least effort in Islamism. And you obviously put Islamism very firmly in your sights in the book. And I just wanted to maybe start by defining your terms here, because how would you define the word Islamism? I know some people are uncomfortable with saying Islam or Muslim, so we'll say Islamism to try and kind of skirt around it. Other people understand it as a separate ideology. How do you define it?
Well, Islamism, you're right to say, is a tricky term to define. I think, put simply, it's the belief that Islam cannot coexist with any form of liberal or other kind of outside ethical framework. It's the belief in the totality of a religious conviction to govern one's life, and how society and the rest of it ought to be governed, and how critically other people ought to lead their lives, right? So it is in its very essence totalitarian. Now, Islamism and Islam are distinct. Islam is a diverse religion which consists of multiple sets of ideas and different people and different practices. However, Islamism is a plausible interpretation of Islamic doctrine. For that reason, there is no Islamism without the first 5 letters of that word, right? So it's very, people who, like me, want to make those distinctions go too far when they say, well, the one has nothing to do with the other, right? In fact, I got into a lot of trouble at university for making this very point, because I said that we need to be able to understand the relationship between the two whilst also recognizing the differences. But there is a relationship there. And partly because of that relationship existing, I want to look at how Islamist ideas exist beyond the writings, attitudes, speeches of Islamist thinkers and ideologues, right? So Islamism beyond Islamists, how Islamism has become in many quarters normalized to the point that its ideas have become banal. And anti-Semitism, of course, is, as you say, is a very kind of conspicuous example of that. But of course, anti-Semitism is directly and inextricably connected to other sort of isms. So you get your homophobia, your sexism, your religious totalitarianism. So whilst I'm able to say that Islamism is an ideology which is a kind of all-consuming one, um, it's become much more sort of, its ideas have percolated down into many quarters, and the ideas which many people cleave to, and they're not necessarily themselves Islamist.
Yeah, it's a good answer. I mean, I see it as a kind of authoritarian branch of Islam. But desire to kind of impose it on other people, I think, is where we draw the distinction, wouldn't we, between a religious practice and something a bit more sinister. I mean, talk to me about this idea of there's like a tradition of sort of westernized Jews changing their surnames to kind of erase Jewish ancestry for one reason or the other. It's quite common, I think. I've got friends who have done this. You've mentioned that your paternal grandfather did this. I think there's some famous people who have done this. I think famously the creator of Batman, Bob Kane, was Bob Khan, and changed. I think there's a term for it, and it just escapes me. Maybe you'll know. I think it's something like Hebraise, like erase and Hebrew mixed together. Perhaps I might have imagined that. You'll have to let me know.
Right. Yeah. Well, we anglicised ours.
Right.
To be honest, I'm very thrilled they did, because of course I think our name prior to its anglicisation, if that's a word, was in fact Marx, right? So
it's a whole kettle of fish,
and to be honest with you, there already is a Marxism. There isn't yet a Markhamism. So I'm sort of pleased my family kind of sort of foresaw this young dissident come along, but to be honest with you, there is an effort amongst Jews to sort of, and this is part of the desire to assimilate, right, not just integrate, assimilate, to really shed that which is seen as kind of parochial, or that which presents a stumbling block to being a part of British society. So if you look at the history of Jewish assimilation in Britain, it's very much been about, you don't speak Yiddish, you speak English, and you be a part of the society, and that's a kind of philosophy which I grew up with, and at the same time I also was able to embrace the traditional Jewish identity. And it's precisely my experience as a minority, right, as a British Jew, right, and one that is able to reconcile my private religious convictions with being a part of wider democratic secular society. It's that which has driven me to try and amplify the voices of Muslims that are also working for that reconciliation, that believe that reconciliation is possible. And it is.
I always seem to find that a lot of political viewpoints, as soon as somebody espouses a strong political viewpoint, if it's pro-life, you kind of know where they sit politically. If they're very into climate change, you know where they sit politically. And it just seems to be one of them things. If they're extremely anti-Muslim, you know probably where they sit politically. However, when someone's anti-Semitic, I have to do a bit more digging. All bets are off, because it seems to me you can find it quite easily on the left. You can find it especially easy on the right as well. And it's always wrapped up in conspiracy. I think you've got this great quote in your book from David Patterson, a scholar of Jewish studies. He said, for the anti-Semite, the premise is not that all Jews are evil, but that all evil is Jewish. And I think that perfectly sums up the conspiracy theories. And what explains this unique amount of conspiracy theory and suspicion of one particular minority?
Well, the conspiratorial nature of anti-Semitism gives anti-Semitism its distinct flavour. Jean-Paul Sartre famously remarked in his book Jew and Other that if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. Right. So in that train of thought, the Jew is a kind of, the Jew, to borrow from that German thinker, the Jew is the cause of our misfortunes.
It's like a bogeyman archetype type of deal.
Yeah, exactly. To me, anti-Semitism is an ideology which is, as I describe, is a psychosis, in that the worldview of anti-Semites, are far removed from any basis in reality, right? Which, of course, is is kind of common in racism, but anti-Semitism is a lot more of a kind of all-consuming, obsessive, and almost incurable worldview. And actually, I prefer the word worldview as opposed to racism, because I don't see anti-Semitism as a racism. I see it as the first cause, or as Christopher Hitchens would call it, the godfather of racisms. And it's a way of thinking about the world, right? Which is why it's such a foundational principle in totalitarian movements, essential principle actually, that the anti-democratic impulse must necessarily have an anti-Jewish problem, which is why I agree with you. It's hard to sort of divide anti-Semitism into sort of, it may have sort of a right-wing flavour and a left-wing flavour, but ultimately, just to illustrate this, when I think it was when George Galloway was running for Rochdale, and Nick Griffin, former leader of the BNP, and not such a nice guy, came out and endorsed Galloway, right? So what could bring this, I'm not going to say why. He might have white supremacist leanings. I don't really know Nick Griffin's views that well, but whatever. Okay.
I think you're on safe ground.
BNP.
I think you're on safe ground with that.
Yeah, okay, fine. Well, I don't want to upset him. And what could lead him to endorse Galloway, of all people, this veteran left winger, right? Well, they both share the view that the Jew is our misfortune, and the sense that Jews are not merely part of the liberal orbit, but they are the very cause of liberalism, the very cause of all that's evil in the world, right? And so they may have different motivations, but every anti-Semite, regardless of what drives him or her or them, is driven by a sense that the Jew must be eradicated in order for us to be liberated from that which holds us back, right? And for that reason, I think, I can't remember which thinker described it this way, but anti-Semitism is murderous by its very conviction, because it has to view the world without the Jews. It imagines a world in which we are freed from any kind of Jewish evil. So that's why anti-Semitism, unlike other racisms, in a sense, necessarily leads to violence and murder, because it's an essential part of how it views the world and how it views a world without the Jews.
Yeah. I mean, this might be flogging a dead horse at this point, but I can't resist an opportunity to give Jeremy Corbyn a good kicking.
Right. Go for it.
Yeah, I was a lifelong Labour voter until Jeremy Corbyn took over, and a lot of the themes of what Jeremy Corbyn's about ties into your book as well. This kind of reflexive hatred of the West, the most unfortunate anti-racist on the planet I've heard him described, and I had a huge amount of trouble convincing people that what he stood for was anti-Semitic, and it was very difficult to call him outright anti-Semitic. I mean, I think people expect him to have ran around shouting "fuck the Jews" or something for it to count as true anti-Semitism. And I just wanted to get your perception on where he sits there in that case, because he clearly has a problem with Jews in a sense. Is this a result of anti-Semitism, this kind of hatred of Jews? Is it a well-intentioned, misguided understanding of certain conflicts? What motivates someone like Jeremy Corbyn?
The Corbyn case and others like him, they're interesting because they're peculiar. They're mysterious. You're right. I mean, when my parents were growing up, anti-Semites were you could spot them. They were down the street with the National Front, and they would say, and you could tell an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
And people, Miriam Margolyes said, and I think there's a great deal of truth in this, that anti-Semitism is in a sense naturally English. Well, in a sense, the Jews as the oldest other, both in Britain and across the Western world, that in a sense it's a kind of foundational part of what we are and who we are. So not liking the Jews or having a particular view of the Jews is quite common. But I think what makes Corbyn and others distinct is that their kind of view of the Jews went from being probably, what many people think, which is kind of sort of may even be like a banal, a kind of, insignificant, not particularly sort of potent dislike of Jews, to being something that's a lot more obsessive, and it went down this path, and Corbyn and his ilk subscribe to a worldview in which there are evil forces at play, right? That there are, and that mural, for example, really speaks to that. I don't know if you remember that, but there was a sort of, I can't remember the exact art around it.
Yeah, it's kind of like a hooked-nosed banker counting money.
Right.
Yeah, it was very on the nose. No pun intended.
Exactly. And the great Holocaust historian Leon Polyakov said that anti-Semites charge Jews with diabolical causality, that Jews are the cause of the evils, right? And so Corbyn went from a kind of, that banal dislike to a view in which he saw that anything which had a sort of Jewish influence was evil. And he saw, and I think that this is partly what drives a kind of leftist millenarianism, maybe, or a sort of the kind of revolutionary thought within strains of the left, particularly the new left, which is that in order for us to achieve our kind of socialist state, or a state in which we are freed from the evils of capitalism, we have to deal with the Jewish question. It's why this very idea of how do we deal with the Jews, this, by the way, tiny insignificant people. I mean, we make up, what are we? We're 250, 300,000 Jews here in Britain, and in the world globally, we're 0.0 whatever % of the world population. I mean, we're a tiny people, but yet everyone who has a kind of revolutionary, anti-democratic thought all have to think about, how do we deal with the Jews? What is it about the Jews that's holding us back, that's inhibiting us from achieving our utopia? And Corbyn was that we have to deal with Israel, because Israel, of course, is perceived to be at the forefront of this evil Western hegemon that must be destroyed. That the destruction of Israel, okay, be it democratic, and Corbyn, this sort of wonderful kind of like view of right of return, these other very kind of democratic and peaceful ways of achieving that end of Israel, would, I think, in his view, pave the way for the eventual downfall of what his ideology saw as the evil, which is the West, right? But the prerequisite for that end of the West is, of course, the end of the Jewish state. And it's no coincidence that he puts the Jewish state, and he sees the Jewish state as the forefront, the very source of the evil hegemon itself.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on this idea in your book, which I've seen elsewhere, and you kind of subscribe to, that you can really do a health check of a nation or a society by how well it treats its Jews. And why does that ring true to you?
I think it goes back to the time of Dreyfus, and of course, I mean, it predates that, and actually there are many kind of metaphysical reasons for anti-Semitism, and I think I might return to those soon. But during the time of Dreyfus, those on Dreyfus' sides were understood to be intellectuals. That those in favour of Dreyfus's innocence, and he was innocent, of course.
It's the man accused of being an informant or a spy, and
yeah. Being a spy in the French, and of course a traitor in the French army, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, and then the perception of Jews in France really divided the country, and it became foundational for how, people would view how French society viewed people around them. So those on the side of Dreyfus' innocence were termed intellectuals. They were seen as being in favour of rationality, in favour of republicanism, in favour of the very things which make France, thankfully, a secular state today. Conversely, those opposed to him were seen as protecting the old guard, the old orthodoxies. And I see that. How could it be that the perception of Jew informs how you perceive all those other things like democracy, progressivism, liberalism, and so on? Well, I think it goes to the point the philosopher Levinas made when he said that anti-Semitism is really an attack on the other. It's the very sanctity of otherness which is under assault when you attack the Jews, because the Jews embody that otherness as the old other, right? So, and if you attack otherness, it strikes me that you attack the very principles upon which a liberal state is based upon. And I think foundational in a functioning liberal state is the right to be other. So necessarily, if you attack the people who represent otherness, you attack otherness itself, and in so doing, you attack the very foundation, the very fabric of liberalism itself.
Yeah, I mean, as we were saying at the start of the conversation, you really do touch on some very sensitive issues. You know, immigration and Islam are huge in terms of landmines to navigate. But as you also reiterated, your book's not hostile. It's not bigotry. And it's very data driven. In fact, mainstream sources of statistics to back up your arguments about these things, which I always appreciate. And I just wanted to circle, very tentatively this issue of immigration. That is the thing that can seemingly get anyone in trouble very quickly in the UK. I mean, we both know it's a very horrible conversation to try and engage people on. But I suppose, there is a distinct unwillingness of people to at least acknowledge the possibility that an influx of individuals who do not share the same liberal values may have a detrimental effect to a nation or a culture. I mean, how best do we lay out this argument without, othering other people, coming across as generalizing, being bigots and things like that?
Well, that's the challenge of our time as people who believe in centrism and liberalism. How do we articulate a position which is both assertive and also responsible I think that is a delicate balance and a very difficult I think a very difficult situation to navigate. But my view is that we have to be willing to say some unpalatable things. Some of those things include that not all cultures and values are of equal value. Moral relativism is wrong. The idea that we can treat all ideas as equal is a bad idea. Now, of course, each person, each individual, no matter to the ideas they cleave to, should be treated with dignity and with respect. That goes without saying, but not all cultures and values. Because to do that, it becomes self-negating. To treat ideas of being, in our society where women are valued, thank God, where we respect the right of people to dress how they please, that's very good, and all these other sort of rights and liberties accorded to citizens. For us to say, well, those values are on the same moral footing as FGM or racism or homophobia, I'm not having it. And liberals should say no to that. And that to me is the failure of liberalism, is that it's become so it's really lost its grip on the moral ground, which is why, of course, the populist right has taken over the secular battle, which to me is terrible. It's astonishing that the very organizations and movements which once championed religious orthodoxy have now become its nemesis, and we have become the enabler of religious fanaticism. So we have to get back to a liberal, the belief in, critical liberal principles, but at the same time be able to make the arguments that we are not going to accept some things in our culture because they are wrong.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I'm really glad that you champion the cause of liberalism. I'm a diehard liberal, often very depressed about the situation, as I'm sure you are. But it is nice to read objective criticism of these things from a liberal perspective. Obviously, you travel enough time in these waters and you will come across polemics from the populist right as well, who will kind of prop up a sort of Christian nationalism as a suggestion for a solution. And I, depending on whether I've had my coffee in the morning and how hopeless I'm feeling, I kind of go back and forth as to whether liberalism will and can be an effective tool to the problems we face. I mean, can liberalism still save us? Is it a sharp enough tool to face the problems we've got, given how much damage has already been done by the failure of liberalism?
I don't think liberalism is fit for purpose today.
Right.
I really don't. It's not effective. It lacks any appetite to have any real intellectual, cultural, and philosophical introspection and reflection. It has no. It almost doesn't understand why people feel so angry with it. Right? Its main sort of voices don't seem to grasp that, and instead they find it's much more convenient, of course, for them to be able to, label the likes of Reform far right and anyone who votes for them far right. But this to me is an absurdity. Most people who vote Reform are not necessarily ideologically but they're not necessarily ideologically committed to this sort of net zero migration and sort of intellectually confident in sort of the writings of reform's kind of intellectual backbone. They're not. They're just really pissed off with this liberal status quo. And so we have to be able to have that kind of critical inner reflection. Liberals won't have it because I don't think they quite understand the magnitude of the problem, and I think by the time they do, it will all be too late. Which is why I feel now the best chance liberals or liberalism has is if populism actually does win, because I think the success of populism might well spark that important paradigm shift within the centre ground, because there isn't nothing else is really doing it. And I look at how centrists across the continent are now responding to the very real prospect of them being voted out and populist right parties coming in, be that in France or in Germany or in the Netherlands and so on, and they are changing their tune somewhat. I mean, even Starmer's statement, we're an island of strangers, right? I mean, he's just plucked that out straight out of Farage's book, right?
I think they were comparing him to Enoch Powell after that. Well, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, gosh, what a comparison! But that is partly where we are in this this radical shift, and Farage and Reform and the populist right have changed the debate. Whether or not these parties actually act on it and do something about it, and put the money where their mouth is, as it were, well, that's time will tell. But at least the conversation, the dynamic of the conversation is changing, in part thanks to the democratic revolt of populism.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the quote unquote Muslim vote in your book quite a bit across Europe, and how that pertains to the UK as well. And you're obviously very clear to point out that Muslims aren't a political monolith. There are the diversity of thought and opinion, but there is a significant signal within that community that's worth coveting from our politicians, I believe. Not so much with the Jewish community being such a small minority. I think it's the same thing with young teenagers. Nobody bothers to try and placate them. Obviously, like you mentioned in the book, the Tories go for the pensioners. I mean, how dangerous is this, given the statistics on Muslim attitudes in the UK to certain things like homosexuality, Israel, things like that we see a lot of politicians actively trying to appeal to the more conservative elements of Islam in order to get the votes?
Well, this is the astonishing thing now about the political left, is that the political left, um, on the micro level, so in certain constituencies, towns, cities, areas, they have to talk culturally right, right? And not just culture, not just sort of traditional working class right. I mean, we're talking religious right, which to me is anathema. I mean, it's not what the left does. The left, you know, can protect culturally conservative attitudes without indulging in attitudes which bleed into religious dogmas. It's a bit insane, but they've had to because, of course, democracy is governed by what the demos want, by what the people want, by what their electorate want. And so, when I hear the likes of, or when I don't hear the sort of condemnation from senior Labour front benchers of the kind of totalitarianism we're seeing, right? Well, I think to myself, I don't blame them. I mean, the likes of Jess Phillips or Wes Streeting, who almost lost their seat in the last election thanks to independent Muslim candidates. Well, why should they speak out? If I were in their position, I wouldn't. And this, I suppose, is the very flaw with democracy, is that you are going to formulate policies and ideas which speak to the people who vote for you, and you depend upon those votes. This is why anti-Semitism won't be dealt with just as a Jewish issue. It is going to have to be, if people, which is why I want people to view anti-Semitism as not being sort of anti-Jewish, but anti-British, but and anti-Western. But the Muslim vote and the role it plays, no doubt, plays a part in the political and social reluctance of many to speak out and deal with the problems we face.
It's a good answer. So Harry, you're the title of your book, "The Melted Pot," is a clever play on the expression "the melting pot," which, correct me if I'm wrong, I suppose is this kind of really, it's almost a very positive, progressive idea of lots of cultures all coming together under one national identity.
Right.
And obviously, you put the argument forward in your book that that's really a failed experiment in a lot of ways, especially in Europe and the UK. It seems like multiculturalism has just become multicultures, pockets of different cultures, completely alien and distinct from each other, and not really integrating and communicating. What's gone wrong in the UK? Because I will defend the UK as a very open, tolerant place for the most part, especially in the last couple of decades, in the 80s and 70s, maybe not so much. But now I think it's probably one of the best places to live as an ethnic minority, perhaps. You can tell me if you feel differently. So, I mean, what's gone wrong in terms of this idea of multiculturalism in the UK and Europe?
Firstly, I would agree. Actually, the issue of Islamism, for example, I'm much more concerned about it on the continent than I am here. I think it is pretty shit here in terms of the seriousness of the situation, and anti-Semitism and the whole rest of it. But I think in Europe it's a hell of a lot worse, and I think that owes itself to the fact that Britain does diversity better, but I don't see multiculturalism, and I don't see that multiculturalism has been a failure. I see that it's been a delusion, because the ideas which multiculturalism rests upon the idea that people can live side by side with an absence of anything which brings them together, right? So on a kind of conceptual or even philosophical level, that idea strikes me as delusional, because how on earth can you create a cohesive, well-structured, organized society if people are bereft of anything which brings them together from their own communities, and which brings them together with different people from all over the place? And it seems to me that in the dilution of British identity and the marginalization of a cohesive, strong, meaningful national culture, we have melted and become atomized and become so so distant and no doubt in conflict with one another. But I would say that in itself is symptomatic of a societal and cultural delusion, which seems to me to be almost now at the point where I don't think much can be done to resolve this, other than trying to, I would say, damage limitation, in the sense that we have to be able now to have an effective discussion about borders and really, manage our borders, but also recognize that the problem we face now, and not necessarily with migrants, but with second, third generation people here whose families been living here, who feel so at odds from British society. And so we have to deal with this beyond just policies. We have to deal with this through those cultural and philosophical channels. But again, I feel it could well be too late.
Yeah. I mean, you do a lot of analysis of, hate crime and things like that in your book, and, with recourse to statistics on that. And you also mention, obviously, acknowledge the fact that Muslims are the target of this as well. And it seems like,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's my worry.
Yeah, I mean, these things are difficult to... Sorry, go ahead.
Can I just say, one of my worries is that if we don't deal with this, right, and, as someone who used to work for a Muslim organization, I am very worried for Muslims in Britain.
Yeah.
Because I think that if we're not willing to have these conversations, what I'm seeing, in what we saw in Southport, what we saw last night in Northern Ireland, in terms of anti-migrant rights, these things will become a lot more out of hand, and that has very serious implications. So my desire to talk about this isn't just for my own community and for British society, but it's also because I think it's necessary to have these things out in the open so we can best protect those communities, particularly those who are struggling to find this reconciliation.
No, I mean, that's a great point, and it's a concern I share as well. This horrible idea that if, I suppose, sensible, rational liberals won't take control of the situation, far scarier people will do horrible things in response. And that this isn't a kind of mouth-watering premonition of looking forward to something. It's a terrifying prospect to me that things really could go backwards for minorities in this country. And obviously, you like I say, you circled around hate crimes a lot. I mean, these figures can be quite difficult to parse. A lot of interest groups do inflate them with kind of mean comments on the internet and things like that. But what seems true to me right across the board in Europe as well, and I think even as far as America, if you look at sort of violent targeted hate crimes, anti-Semitic hate crimes always tend to top the polls there and the statistics. It feels like there's not a lot of sort of Jewish interest groups banging the drum about that, to the point where when you explain this to people, they're very surprised to hear it. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that in terms of Jewish safety now, especially post October the 7th. We're hearing a lot of reports from Jews either fleeing Europe now or certainly making plans to. How do you feel in terms of, Jewish safety in Europe at the moment?
Look, I walk around London with my Star of David out and my sort of Serge Gainsbourg chest hair all sort of gushing out. And I have to say, I lead a very pleasant and safe life in London. Thank God. And I love this city, and I love my country, and I love my country because it allows me to have this hyphenated identity where I can be patriotic, deeply patriotic, and also very proud and loyal to my own tradition, religious tradition. But there is an atmosphere change. Of that, there is no doubt, in the sense that I've come to feel that throughout Western Europe and here in Britain, once again, there is a sense that the Jews are our misfortune, and that there are many people now, not necessarily hard left-wingers, but liberal-minded people who are beginning to fall into an ideology which sees that Jews, and and that manifests in Zionism. Zionism and Jews are responsible for something which needs to be dealt with, and no doubt that leads to people targeting Jews. And they may not do so intentionally, they may not do so verbally, they may not do so physically, they may not even do so, online, but there is an atmosphere change which is, I think, providing the fertile ground for something horrendous to happen to a Jewish community here in Europe. We are very close now to something terrible happening in Europe to the Jews. And I'm very careful not to indulge in hyperbole or anything like that. But we are now in a place where Jews in Europe are in very serious danger. And the very people who, if heaven forbid this incident happens, the very people who have said no, who will say, no doubt, this is not in our name, and we totally condemn this is all wrong, they have provided with their indulgence of blood libels and serious misinformation, profoundly malicious misinformation. They have contributed to an atmosphere which will lead, and it only takes one person to do something horrendous. We have never been closer to that in recent years. And Western European Jews, I say in the book that unless there is some serious change, then we are kind of fucked. But unless something is done, as I speak to my partner about this regularly, we will move because it isn't safe, and I don't want to raise kids in a country where they feel this kind of vulnerability, because it isn't right, it is wrong, and it isn't just a sense of being uncomfortable, it is a real potential for violence, and the time is ticking, and eventually it will all be too late, and I don't want to have to reach that point, which is why my book is not just a kind of call for an introspection, it's an urgent call to action.
Good answer, Harry. I think maybe just to spend the last 8 minutes or so talking about a non-controversial topic, Israel.
Sure.
So
right. Completely.
It's fascinating to me the kind of relationship the British left have with the conflicts over there. I'm very interested in what it means to British Jews. I know there's not one single answer that kind of answers for all Jews, but for instance, I've interviewed David Baddiel on this topic. He has a very interesting take on his relationship with Israel, which I think is kind of like an Israel thing. It's got nothing to do with him. You shouldn't have to answer for Israel as a British Jew, and that's a position I really respect. I've also had Jake Wallace-Simons on the show, and his viewpoint's completely different. He thinks that I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it's in the realm of, he thinks maybe Jews have a responsibility to defend the only Jewish state on the planet. And I just wanted to get your feelings on Israel in terms of, does this mean something to you as a Jewish person? Do you feel no kind of affinity with it whatsoever? Is it related to British Jews in any way? How does it fit into the picture?
Oh, well, I do think it's very fundamental. And I think for Jews who are totally alienated from their own Jewish identity, or, from Jewish tradition, but still very much feel a part of, Jewish culture and being a Jew, Israel matters, and there is a sense of collective shared responsibility for the state. Does that mean that every Jew will defend Israel or defend its governments resolutely? No, of course not. There are many Jews who will vocally oppose their or state their opposition towards the government of Israel, right? But that in itself is a demonstration of the feeling British Jews have towards Israel, that they do feel it's a part of their identity. To me, Israel is a moral necessity. a moral imperative, and I've argued that my belief in Zionism is that because of anti-Semitism's permanence and almost the eternality of, I can never say that word, of Jew hate, and its potential to explode in murderous barbarism, it's a necessity. And I do think there is a responsibility amongst not just Jews, but people who believe in civilization to defend it. And and what I kind of shrink from is this sense that, when people say Israel has a right to exist and a right to defend itself, well, I don't believe that people need to go and defend Israel by saying those things, because that lends credence to the idea that Israel should be treated as a pariah state, which is a kind of exception. Now, my view is that Israel has a responsibility to act in a way in which every other sovereign nation on earth would act, and particularly after October 7th. We were having this conversation last night. After that tragedy, Israel was right to have done what any other nation on earth would have done, which is defend itself. And it's almost as if the perception of those who are hostile to Israel, and I know this is getting away from your question, but the perception of those who vilify and delegitimize Israel kind of are at odds with its very raison d'etre, which is this idea that Jews can defend themselves. Jews are empowered. It's that idea that the Jew has a sense of that the Jew determines their own future, right? Not at the behest of a kind of European power. And that, to many, is just a kind of unconscionable view, because it's at odds with this historical perception of how the Jews ought to be. And so Israel is the negation of the downtrodden, the disempowered, the weak Jew. And defending Israel, then, is to treat Israel like you would treat any other nation. And I see that now as a moral cry of our time.
It's another good answer, Harry. I mean, it might be worth just finishing on something darkly humorous then. I mean, I know it's a serious topic, but I can't help...
Go on.
I
like dark humor.
Yeah, well, I can't help feel very entertained this last week by the activities and adventures of Greta Thunberg. And
she's lovely.
Yeah, and I just wanted to get your perception on this kind of, I think, other people have referred to it as sort of the omni cause, and I think I alluded to it a little bit at the start of this conversation, whereas if
what cause?
The kind of omni cause, where if you're all in on
I like that term.
Yeah, so if you're all in on climate change, you're obviously going to be a Kiev-wearing Free Palestine advocate. I mean, just to be clear, I believe in climate change, but I don't go as far as just stop oil or anything, people like that. And I just wanted to get your perception of somebody like that who has the kind of the hubris to jump on a boat and think they can just rock up in the protected waters and deliver, quote unquote, deliver aid to Gaza, and then kind of cry foul when the IDF intercepts. And what's been your perception of the goings on this week? And might I add, her refusal to watch the documented footage of some of the atrocities that took place on October 7th.
Oh, is that the case? You refused to watch it?
That's what's been reported. So all the reports suggest that the IDF offered the people there the opportunity to watch the footage, and they refused.
Well, how could she? I mean, it's impossible to reconcile the two polarities here. One, you have the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, and the other, you have this sense that the Palestinians have a right of resistance. Right, by any means. Well, let's look at the means they employed, and you cannot reconcile those two things. Those are two polarities which cannot, coexist, and so she can't watch it because it would be intellectually impossible and morally impossible for her to square those things, to square that circle. But to be honest with you, Greta and others like her, they're extremely nice, and all of what they do is done in the name of being nice, and I have a lot of respect for that sense of human altruism, and I don't really have to to be honest, many people are very quick to call out her double standards, and I think they're right to condemn her for not watching the video. Although for reasons I just laid out, I don't think she can. Or that I think it would cause her profound moral distress. But I also would say that Greta is part of what I see now as the kind of well-intentioned but so naive and blind left-wing, forward-thinking progressive, which is why, and it's like she just doesn't see, right? It's like these people, they just don't see the barbarism and the sheer wickedness of what Israel is resisting. And it's almost as if because we see suffering and by all means call out suffering, and by all means condemn it, and by all means help those who are suffering, that's completely fine, and those are all laudable things to do. But the idea that this is a kind of the moral evil is the very state which is resisting a moral evil, right? That naivety has allowed and has become the very enabler of the forces which unleashed that evil wrath on the 7th of October. It wouldn't have happened without the kind of leftist credence it was lent and continues to be lent. It doesn't, that kind of evil doesn't flourish without it, which is why, in my book I look at how the sort of murderous anti-Semitism has all been koshered in the name of intellectualism. It's been given that acceptability, and that acceptability may not necessarily promote violence against Jews, but it provides the breathing space and the correct ecosystem for that violence to erupt. And Greta is just a product of that echo chamber, and perhaps is a very significant part of it. But I would say that she's very well intentioned, but ultimately it's her ilk which continues to drive and perpetuate not only Palestinian suffering, but the very forces which would, if they had it their way, destroy the West and all good things.
Yes, a lot of responsibility for one Swedish girl, for sure.
I know. She can't really hack it.
No. All right, Harry. Well, I've really enjoyed speaking to you. I really enjoyed the book. Like I said, it really does delve into some very tricky and delicate waters, but you do it with care and compassion. You're very objective. You always appeal to the statistics and the data, which I think is great. And obviously, it's a very important topic, and I'm glad you're writing about it. So thank you for writing that.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
It's my pleasure. Is there any way people can get a hold of you if they want to send you some feedback?
Yeah. Oh, it's on Amazon or on Twitter. Oh, to get the book or to give me feedback or what?
Both. What your social media handles and where can people get your fine book?
Yeah. You can follow me. I've got this really weird X handle, Markham Harry at Go1 or something. My name's Harry Saul Markham. You probably just type that in and you'll find me. And the book is on Amazon and all the usual sort of places. Then will be available, I hope, in bookshops very soon. We've just had some supply issues, but we're working, as Keir Starmer will put it, working at pace to resolve it. Yeah. Please do, and I'd love to hear feedback, questions, anything. Yeah.
Awesome, Harry. Lovely to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Cheers.